So thank you to everyone on Zoom and in the room for coming today to the SYNAPSE Seminar, which is run in the School of Culture, History and Language here at ANU. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country which I'm currently on in Canberra, which is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and also the traditional owners, sorry, I'm still admitting people, the traditional owners of the lands on which other people are joining from. So today it's a great pleasure to have Peter Matthews here to talk to us. Peter is Professor in the Department of Cross-Field Research at the National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka. And he's an ethnobotanist with interest in the prehistory of Asia and the Pacific, and focuses a lot on wild relatives and wild populations of taro in Southeast Asia. And so he had general interest in the evolution, ethnobotany and domestication of taro, and he's also involved in curating ethnographic collections for Oceania and in museum exhibitions. And yes, it's really wonderful to have you here, Peter, and today talking about the commensal wilderness within. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's a good introduction. My work in Southeast Asia really began in Australia and New Guinea with fieldwork in northeast Queensland and also in Papua New Guinea. But it was in northeast Queensland that I first saw wild taro growing in apparently natural habitats, and that gave me a clue for my later work in Southeast Asia. So it was a very sort of formative time that I had as a student at ANU. The illustration that I'm starting with is a painting that I saw for the first time last week in Bangkok, and it's from the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. The entire painting is immense. It runs for perhaps 100 meters. And this is just one scene from many through the painting. And it kind of illustrates the idea of a wilderness within, because we have a very human occupied landscape. It's also a landscape occupied by celestial figures. And in the middle, we have a tidal river or creek coming into the landscape with wild animals, and also wild taro in this scene. And there's some kind of forest burning in the top right. I'm not sure if that's land management or punishment. Now let's go to the next. Can we have the next, please? I need to click, maybe.
Yep, that should be at your end, Peter.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why is it not responding to my keyboard? Okay, so in Bangkok, we can also find in the present landscape many canals and the main course of the Chao Phraya River. And the canal system is full of wild taros. There are hundreds of these patches of wild taro scattered through Bangkok. And one of them is shown here on the left. And down at the lower left is a plant and flower. And if we look at the painting from the Ramayana mural, we can see wild taro and flower on the bank, and there's a empty canoe and a crocodile diving down, and it looks like something bad has just happened. So this is a kind of wild space inside a human space. In Bangkok today, the plants are completely urban, but they are freely breeding and spreading as a likely remnant of the natural lowland flora. And the mural artists lived in this same area. So here's an outline of what I'm presenting today. Part one, production system diversity, and this is a model that I would like to introduce in detail. Part 2 is talking about range expansion by plants, and I will give 3 case studies. And part 3 is translocation before domestication. So regarding production system diversity, I will show a general model based on human ecological relationships. And this is really a response to Sutton and Walsh, their book 2021, Farmers or Hunters and Gatherers, and also to a range of earlier papers that I've listed here. With regard to range expansion, I will talk about the paper mulberry and the Austronesian expansion. And this is an example of going from no genetic control to total control with translocation of a probably single female clone into the Pacific. The second case is wild taros in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And I will discuss a common commensal wild form of taro, clade 1, and contrast that with a very accurate natural hybrid, which is in clade 2. These clades are reference to recent chloroplast DNA research that I will introduce as well. And the third case that I would like to introduce is the sacred lotus in northern Australia. And this is an example of translocation that has probably transformed wetland productivity without genetic control or cultivation. And finally, I want to talk about the role of translocation in creating commensal wild populations, and suggest that translocation and domestication of the environment, this could be the main story for polycultural production systems globally in the past and the present. The two models of range, I will introduce 2 models of range expansion before domestication. So in this talk, I'm not really going into domestication per se. My focus is on what happens before domestication. Hunting, husbandry, gathering, planting, cultivation, fishing, and aquaculture, these are specific methods that all coexist in most production systems. When we debate the transitions between gathering, farming, and agriculture, this begs the question of how methods are combined in diverse production systems. And we can refer to Taro et al. 2003 on this subject. The common terms are conceptually limiting and confuse specific methods with general systems. The translocation of plants and animals can cross the boundaries of diverse production systems and transform landscapes with and without cultivation or husbandry. Modern examples are the introduction of gorse into New Zealand after its introduction from England. And my ancestors were directly involved in this translocation. Another example is the interaction between farmers and wild boar. And here I show a picture of a farmer raising captured offspring of hunted wild boar. And here's more on boar hunting. I emphasize the boar and pigs because this is part of the story of taro as well. So on the left is an example of boar hunting in Mughal, India, and at right, a boar hunting competition that I happened to run into in New Zealand. We have lots of boar in New Zealand. So the model I'm producing is completely invented. It's not based on any actual data. So this graph is an imaginary graph. It's a thought experiment. And it suggests a general model of biological production based on human relationships with plants and animals. The axes of the graph describe measurable human, in principle, measurable human ecological relationships. There are no space-time dimensions. It's a hypothetical scatter plot. The ratios that I show on the axes, on the bottom we have polyculture versus monoculture, and the measurement is the number of utilized species in polyculture versus the number of utilized species in monoculture. And the left-hand axis is the number of species in which reproduction and breeding are controlled versus those for which the breeding system is not controlled. So control of the breeding system is what we need for genetic domestication. And not all cultivated plants are domesticated in genetic terms. So when we look at this graph, we have controlled breeding and monoculture dominant at the top left, and at the bottom right, we have uncontrolled breeding and polyculture dominant. And each circle in this graph represents a production system in its entirety in any geographical unit. This can be a country or a standard area grid like 10 square kilometers or 100 square kilometers. It doesn't really matter. So that's the setup that I will discuss in the following slides. If we look at the top left with monoculture dominant, this is really what we see with enclosed industrial production. And at the bottom right, we have the case of open landscape production. And in the case of industrial agriculture, we have low diversity and high external imports and a fragile system that is dependent on very few species. And at the bottom right, we have systems that incorporate high diversity, have low external inputs, and are resilient. This graph says nothing about whether plants are cultivated or not cultivated. It's merely which plants or animals are part of the cultural interaction with plants and animals. So it's polyculture in a broad sense. And just to be clear, the graphs can be flipped to change the point of view, because viewers often have a visual bias. So we can put polyculture and open breeding in a symbolically high position at the top left, or we can put monoculture and controlled breeding in that position. Or you can look at the lower axis as being foundational and the other vertical axis as being derived. What I'm trying to say is that there's no implication of social value in the presentation of the graph itself. We're looking at the same graph again, and one thing we can say is that high input monoculture erodes landscapes and also erodes ecological knowledge. So the example that I show in the top left is from northern Vietnam. These almost vertical hillsides have been planted with corn, and the more gentle slopes have been planted with sugarcane. So these are C4 crops taking over the world in a sense. And although the road system is very poor, this new monoculture that's arrived in the mountains of Vietnam is supported by mechanical transport. At the same time, in Vietnam, we can find many examples of polycultural production. And in the lower right, I show an example of harvesting wild taro in Hue province. And this is actually coming from the middle of Hue city in one of the canals, rather similar to the situation in Bangkok. So production systems change continuously over space and time, and different production systems can coexist with spatial separation. And so the arrows here are indicating changes over space or time. There can be, it's not too difficult to change from one polycultural system to another polycultural system with the addition of a few crops or the exploitation of different wild resources. And while the high input monoculture is erosional, low input polyculture enriches landscapes with wild resources and enriches ecological knowledge of those landscapes, because it depends on having a deep knowledge of many different wild and cultivated plants. The historical time dimension can be shown as an overlay. And here I would suggest that on the left, these systems that are more or less monocultural and often depending on domesticated crops, these represent modern industrial farming and has been an ideal in capitalist industrial agriculture just for the last 100 years. It's actually a very strange thing that has happened in recent human history. On the other hand, open polyculture with little or no genetic control has been probably dominant for 100,000 years or more. This is the basic condition. And we can imagine that while early modern humans have been mainly dependent on wild resources, they can also be locally dependent on a certain number of cultivated or even domesticated crops. We don't really know the true time depth of the domestication of all plants. We have very fragmentary information. In the middle of this graph, I imagine that these systems correspond to smallholder farming with access to wild resources. And this is the main arena for plant and animal domestication and has been dominant for at least 10,000 years. So these are systems where farmers have access to wild resources, they're hunting and gathering, the farms themselves are targets for wild animals, so the farm itself becomes a locus for hunting and trapping because it attracts wild animals. And we have just a great variety of possible systems in different environments in different parts of the world. An example of a polycultural village is shown in the top right. This is from southern Korea, with local monoculture of rice in the foreground, but then village gardens just full of a whole range of crops. In this case, mostly domesticated crops. So in all production systems, there are uncontrolled, generative, creative, disruptive elements that persist. There is no stasis. And this, in a sense, is what I refer to as the commensal wilderness within. Even a single individual plant with its genotype, after domestication, the majority of the genome is unchanged from the wild type. It's just a few changes, perhaps, in regulatory genes that make it a domesticated plant. So even the single individual plant can be considered to have a wilderness within in genetic terms. Diseases evolve and spread, birds, insects, weeds invade, gardens lie fallow or cycle in and out of fallow and swidden systems, and translocated plants breed or naturalize. So there are many ways that wildness continues to exist inside polycultural production systems. If it's efforts to cultivate and control very enormously, it's not an all or nothing thing between agriculture and hunting and gathering. That's a kind of false comparison. Major transformations in the polycultural systems can result from the use of new tools, the translocation of new plants and animals, and the control of fire. So these polycultural systems, with or without domesticated plants, are highly developed. It's not random use of random resources. They're highly developed systems. They just happen not to involve domesticated plants. At the top left, we have the possibility of major transformations resulting from tools, translocation of plants and animals, the use of energy in fertilizers. These are the high input systems. And then new systems of control of land, fire, water, plants, and animals. So that's the modern condition with enclosed agriculture and dependence on a few industrial commodity crops. So at this point, I wonder if we should have some questions about what I've just spoken about. I can pause for any questions on that. Maybe Beth can decide.
If people online could raise an electronic hand, and then in the room raise a hand. Anything?
Okay.
I think it's all been very clear, Peter. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just move on. So my first case study is paper mulberry, which I actually came across here in Kyoto, where I'm speaking from, during a walk in the hillsides. And my wife pointed out a Japanese species of Brucinetia, which is a wild species. And that got me looking into the herbarium to see what the Kyoto University Herbarium had in the way of collections of paper mulberry. Because I knew that paper mulberry, Brucinetia papyrifera, had been reported in New Zealand at the time of European arrival, but had then disappeared. And so that was a mystery that had been hanging in my mind for many years. And I realized that I could start work on this question by looking at herbarium records. The same is true for many useful plants. There's a lot we can still learn from studying the herbarium collections. The paper mulberry here is wild and fruiting on a riverbank in Kyoto, on the main river between Kyoto and Osaka. And this species is an ancient introduction to Japan, originating somewhere in the mainland of Southeast Asia or southern China. And the fruit is really like an inverted fig with the seeds on the outside. The natural range of paper mulberry is uncertain, but is likely from southern China to Thailand or possibly further. It's widely used as a fodder crop for cattle and fiber for crafts. In Japan, it has also been used to stabilize riverbanks as a fast-growing and flood-tolerant species. And it's generally propagated as a clonal crop. The high-value naturally white fiber is used for numerous craft products, including bark cloth or beaten bark paper, which is called dulawang in Indonesia, and molded paper, for example, washi in Japan, and similar papers in Korea and China. And the quality of the fiber or fabric made from paper mulberry is very good for adding pigments. And these scenes are from preparing bark and the bark fiber and molded paper in Japan. When male and female plants are both present, the paper mulberry easily spreads by seeds and becomes invasive in open modified habitats. It's abundant as a commensal wild plant in old paper-making centers such as Kyoto, Tokyo, Hanoi, and Beijing. And it's been listed as an invasive threat for Australia and other countries. I recently found it wild and breeding in New York City in the park at Bronx Zoo. And that's at 40 degrees north. This is far beyond its natural range. The distribution and historical uses of paper mulberry are culturally very significant. On the left, this is a map of distribution that was based on the herbarium records that I found and published in 1996. And at that time, I could not say whether the Pacific plants were male or female, because this had simply not been recorded. But since then, a paper has been published reporting that the Pacific population is essentially female. So it's a clonal dispersal by the Austronesian speakers across the Pacific. When we go into Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia, the natural range is not clear, because the wild breeding populations can also spread with people and establish apparently natural populations, or they may be natural populations. But the range of breeding in Southeast Asia is quite large. And we have a technical, sorry, I've got a screen problem here. Is that showing up on the screen, the Kaspersky?
It is, yes.
Right. How do I get rid of that? Yeah, just put it quick, okay, skip. Okay. There's a technical functional zones of molded paper, molded and beaten paper in Southeast Asia, and then beaten paper and bark cloth, with bark cloth continuing out into the Pacific. And the history of bark cloth is still a very interesting area that's being studied by archaeologists. In Japan, it appears, or Japan and Korea, paper mulberry was domesticated in the form of a hybrid species that is a cross between a local wild species and paper mulberry after introduction. Yeah, next. The paper mulberry is still persistent in a crater on Rapa Nui in far eastern Polynesia. It was planted long ago and is now wild. And when we visited, courtesy of Andrea Zeelenfreund in Chile, we found only the female plants flowering with no seeds. Doug Yen also found the same group of paper mulberry growing in the same crater in the 1960s. So it's a very persistent population. My second case study is taro. This is what I've mainly been working on. This is a recently published map of world distribution based on production records. And the world trade data mainly refers to use of the crop for starch production. Taro is a modern introduction into Asia and Africa, and has spread in cultivation to Africa and all across the Pacific. And it's widespread in Asia as a commensal wild leafy vegetable. And the wild plants are used for food and also as fodder. With a student at Massey University, I was able to send him, Ibra Ahmed, I could send him the many samples from across Asia and the Pacific. These are based on the collection that was originally established in Canberra by Douglas Yen. And I was able to keep the DNA samples until the technology for DNA analysis had made it possible to do this work. So the main finding here was that in a survey of 170 samples collected across Asia, the Pacific, these were wild and cultivated taros, we found 3 different chloroplast DNA clades, 1, 2, and 3. And I've color-coded these as orange for 1, blue for clade 2, and green for clade 3. Clade 2, the blue ones, are really temperate adapted cultivars that I will not talk about further in this presentation. What was striking in this initial survey was that the clade 3 taros were all wild. We don't see the clade 3 chloroplast genome in cultivated taros. The clade 1 chloroplast genome, on the other hand, is found in both wild and cultivated taros. And there's evidence, not yet published, that the clade 1 and clade 2 lineages have hybridized and that there are many hybrid cultivars. Clade 1 has a vast range in cultivation and also as commensal wild populations. We can find clade 1 taros in Nepal, India, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, and all the way across to Easter Island, Hawaii, New Zealand. And what's curious is that among clade 1 taros, we have two extreme different phenotypes. We have the classical large starchy corms that are produced in wetland irrigated systems and also in rain-fed systems in tropical equatorial zone. And we also have commensal wild taros that produce hardly any starch, have long stolons, and the stolons, which are shown here, broken into segments. These can be peeled and used as a vegetable, as well as the petioles and leaves. And in the photo at top right, we have an example of commensal wild taro in the Sylhet Basin in Bangladesh. So clade 1 cultivars and commensal wild forms have very different morphology. And wild taros are semi-aquatic. This is an example from Ba Be Lake in northern Vietnam. This is a lake in limestone country where the water levels rise and fall substantially according to the monsoon. So the water level of the lake can rise 3 meters. And so this is a population of wild taro that is growing around the edge of the lake during the dry season and then is inundated during the wet season. And these plants are perfectly happy under the water until the water drops again. The stolons, however, are brittle and easily break, and they can float to the surface and drift downstream to recolonize on the riverbanks. So these wild populations have both vegetative and seed dispersal. This is a slide to show fruit and seed production of wild taro. In this case, it's on the edge of a lake in northern Myanmar. And here the taro has actually colonized a buffalo wallow, which is a kind of mini pond next to the lake. But in this area of Myanmar, wild taros are also common in ditches and stream banks and other open wetland habitats. The seeds here are very small. They're about 1.5 millimeters long. And it's seeds like this that have also been reported from the Cook Swamp archaeological site. Irrigated taro in southern Japan and the Ryukyu Islands is also clade 1, and the likely origin is Southeast Asia in low wetland environments. These are various scenes of wetland irrigated pond fields in Okinawa and Amami. The commensal wild taros in Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia, like Myanmar and Assam, Northeast India, and Philippines, these grow in ditches around fields, along roadsides, in villages, on riverbanks. It's ubiquitous. And in this case, in southern Vietnam, local people are using eelfish from the ditches around the rice fields and combining this wild eelfish with the stems of wild taro. This was a meal cooked at a local restaurant. In the Philippines, commensal wild taros are also very popular.
Fish and coconut milk.
And
the leaves are often harvested from commensal wild populations and sold fresh or dried. I will explain the photos. Upper left, fresh leaves sold in the market.
Sorry, this is a pre-recorded.
Fresh leaves being harvested from a wild population.
Yeah.
Lower right, various dishes using coconut milk.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. This is a image that I found in a print shop in Kyoto, and it dates from the late 19th century in Kyoto. It illustrates the interaction between wild boar and farmers. This still happens in Japan. And the wild boar here is coming in and taking the young shoots, which are most tender and least acrid. But wild pig or boar have a surprising tolerance for the acridity of taro. And it's the only large mammal that I know that has this tolerance. And I think there's a close triangular relationship between farmers, taro, and wild pig. And this could be a three-way domestication that's happened over a very long time in Southeast Asia. In northern Vietnam, it's common for commensal wild taros to be harvested and then prepared as part of the fodder for pigs in domestic small-scale production. And the wild taro leaf will be mixed with fermented rice from winemaking or rice bran and turned into a gruel that is very popular with the pigs. And according to the farmers, the pigs are very healthy on this diet. They don't grow to a large size, but the taro leaf itself has a lot of tannins and may in a sense be a kind of medicinal food for pig. The same again in Myanmar, another example of a small traditional pig breed, the gruel that's made to feed them, and then people moving along the roadsides collecting wild taro to feed their pigs. Now I'll talk a bit about the natural history of wild taros. Recent exploration in the last 30 years has led to the discovery of many wild colocasia species in the mainland of Southeast Asia, and also in one case, endemic in northern Borneo Island and around Mount Kinabalu. And Colocasia orisbia in Borneo is still in the process of being explored. So we don't know the full distribution range of this or most of the other wild species. Wild taro Colocasia esculenta, on the other hand, has a very wide distribution range. It's unusual compared to other wild Colocasia species. And in the next slide, later slides, I'll talk about Colocasia lehingiae, Spongifolia formosana, orisbia. We analyzed all of these species and to some extent populations of wild taro using complete chloroplast genome analysis. So in the previous work that has been published, we were just looking at short sequences from a small number of loci. So the genetic relationships that are established in that way are not very reliable. Here, the tree diagram has a much stronger structure, but it is still limited by the fact that we have poor taxonomic representation from across all those wild Colocasia species that I listed previously. What we do have here, though, are closely related wild species. And we have clade 3 wild taro associated with other wild species, and in particular with Colocasia lehingiae, which is also known as Colocasia mannii. And it's now, we think that maybe the clade 3 wild taros are actually the product of hybridization between Colocasia esculenta and another wild species, probably a common ancestor with lehingiae or lehingiae itself. In clade 1 and clade 2, we have cultivated taros, and in particular, the tropical wetland taros have wild relatives in Bangladesh that are in these sister clades. Most cultivated taros across the world are a very limited lineage within this tree diagram. So what I will talk about further are the wild clade 3 taros. It's an unexpected result that clade 3 group with lehingiae, and this may represent capture of the clade 3 chloroplast genome by ancient clade 1 taros, and this may be an ancient natural hybrid. We can suggest that because there's quite a lot of genetic divergence within clade 3, with the Queensland wild population being quite different from the mainland Southeast Asian population, but still grouping closely in the larger scheme of things. The wild sister populations for temperate dryland cultivars have not yet been reported, and the tropical wetland cultivars might originate in South Asia. We've found wild sisters in the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. Crosses between plant species or hybridization can be important for domestication and also for generating new ecotypes or new species. When ranges overlap, we call this sympatry, and genetic exchange is more likely. This is when population species or other taxa occur in the same geographical area. The opposite of sympatry is allopatry, living in different places, and many kinds of barrier can separate species and prevent genetic exchange. In this case, I suggest a physical barrier. So hybrids in Colocasia may include crosses between Colocasia lehingiae and Colocasia esculenta to create the clade 3 wild taro lineage. And they can also include crosses between clade 1 and clade 2 cultivated taros, producing many different cultivated clones. Colocasia lehingiae is widespread among the wild species that we find in the mountain areas of Southeast Asia. Colocasia lehingiae, which is synonymous with mannii, is the most widespread wild species apart from taro itself, and is found from India to Thailand, Vietnam, and China. And this is the possible maternal parent for clade 3 wild taro. The floral morphology is distinct, the leaf morphology is distinct, but it is a very close wild relative. This is a summary of the genetic survey of wild taros that fall into the clade 3 lineage. And these clade 3 wild taros are shown by the blue points on the map. We found clade 3 all across Southeast Asia, from southern China, Yunnan, northern Vietnam, central Vietnam, southern Vietnam, central Thailand, and across into Myanmar. There's a huge amount of area in mainland Southeast Asia that has not been explored yet for these wild taros, and also island Southeast Asia. On the right, I show examples of wild taro populations in eastern Papua New Guinea, and also in the original ones that I found in northeast Queensland and Australia. This is a wild population growing on a waterfall near Cairns. The third case study that I would like to introduce is Nelumbo nicifera, or the sacred lotus, which is confusingly also often called water lily. Confusing because there are other plants in another genus which are also called water lily. But the sacred lotus is widespread as an ornamental plant, as a sacred plant, and also as a food plant, often cultivated in East Asia in ponds. And this map is taken from a publication by Lin et al. 2019. It's a very excellent publication. And there's also a very nice historical summary by Muthu Kumaran in 2023 in a book called The Tropical Turn that was published very recently. So among biologists who have studied the lotus, the mainland of Southeast Asia and into South Asia appears to be the natural range or native range of the lotus. And the range has probably been extended by human activities, not only to West Asia, as far as Egypt, but also down through Southeast Asia into Northern Australia. At the bottom left, I have a reproduction of a tile mosaic from Pompeii, showing a Nile River scene from some time before the AD 79 eruption that covered Pompeii and preserved the mosaic painting. And we can see here the fruiting head of lotus facing upright at the time while it is immature. The lotus was introduced to the Nile Delta during the Persian period, sometime around 2,500 years before present, and became a major food source as well as a sacred plant, but is now nearly extinct after drainage and flood control. Theophrastus, writing in the late 4th century BC, noted that the lotus mostly grows of its own accord. However, people also sow it. Once it takes hold, it lasts permanently. So this is an example of how, after human introduction, a plant can become, in a sense, a commensal wild plant. It looks after itself. They're very tough. And the same thing, I think, has happened in Northern Australia. These are images from Lin et al. 2020 comparing wild and cultivated lotus. So the cultivated lotus has been selected for flower forms. There are also varieties selected for the edible seeds, and there are also varieties selected for the edible starchy rhizome that lies in the mud deep underwater. The wild plants, by contrast, have skinnier starchy rhizomes, which are still edible, but often have thorns as well. And this is a farmer selling lotus fruiting heads and seeds in Beijing in 2018. These are clearly cultivated lotus from ponds on the outskirts of Beijing. Sacred lotus is widespread in Papua New Guinea and Northern Australia. These records are from the Virtual Herbarium of Australia. And I've inserted here one detail from Sutton and Walsh 2021, which is not exactly a record of growing, of where the plants grow, but rather the totemic water lily sites. I don't know enough about this map to say whether these are actually sites of water lily growing. I presume they are. The main point I would like to make here is that lotus is a freshwater aquatic plant. It cannot disperse naturally across salt water. So the Wallace line is basically an insurmountable barrier for natural dispersal of the lotus. And this observation occurred to me when I saw lotus fruiting heads washing up on a beach in Lake Biwa in Japan. Lake Biwa is the largest freshwater lake in Japan, and there's abundant lotus growing around the lake, both in cultivation and perhaps wild. When the fruiting heads wash up on a beach, they're empty. In the water, they float upside down with the seed capsules facing down. And we can imagine they're like space capsules floating across the water surface, being blown by the wind and dropping seeds into the mud below as they float. So the seed production system of water lilies is really adapted for freshwater dispersal. This is another opportunity for questions, if anybody would like to ask questions about any of those case studies. Beth, can you keep an eye on that?
Yep, I am. There's none so far, though.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, sorry, Chris has a question. Chris, did you just want to speak out?
Sure. Thanks. Peter, look, I'm loving this. I just wanted to go all the way back to your Brucinetia papyrifera map, where you've got a distribution of bark cloth that just aligns beautifully. And I can't remember if we've argued or discussed this before, but aligns beautifully with an argument for a kind of a secondary expansion of Austronesian speaking populations out of eastern Indonesia into island Melanesia, North New Guinea, and around the south coast. So it's a conversation we've got to pick up on, because we're finding things like rat incisors and personal pronouns and a whole bunch of other things that all seem to map in much the same kind of way and suggest a secondary, much delayed expansion out of eastern Indonesia with technologies and symbols and various other things. So just flagging that for further conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, this is the last part of the talk. So polycultural productions emerge in complex ways, and they are composed of many species, each with its own history of range expansion, with or without cultivation and domestication. And so here in the last part of my talk, I want to introduce two models of range expansion. Before we can understand domestication in genetic terms, we need to explore models of natural range and range expansion. Here, this is a rather complicated slide full of text, but what I'm trying to explain here are the elements of range expansion before domestication. And the diagram is really a key for the population categories in the diagrams that follow for the two models. So green here is the natural range of wild populations, and we can think of this as the time zero condition. Plants have a natural range before humans come into the story. This is the most basic element, and everything starts with wild plants and animals. Each has its own natural range, ecology, and potential relationship with us. The second key here is early commensal wild range before cultivation. Commensal wild populations always appear in human activity areas, along trails, around earthworks, around food processing sites. So they can be incidental, but they can also be deliberately established in wild habitats near settlement. And the area of first cultivation, every cultivated plant has at least one area of first cultivation, but cultivation, in fact, can begin independently in more than one area at a time. So this is, in very simple terms, we talk about an area of first cultivation, but we have to bear in mind that there can be more than one area. Commensal wild populations can be derived in a multitude of different ways. So the dark green symbol here is a later commensal wild population derived from a natural wild population. So within the natural range, wild plants of natural origin can invade modified habitats in and around settlements. Commensal wild plants can also be derived from previous commensal wild plants, so there can be continuity within the open modified habitats. Commensal wild plants can spread by themselves and through accidental, systemic, or deliberate translocation by people. Systemic here means that the system itself helps propagate the plants. It's not accidental, it's not deliberate, it's just part of the system. It's how things happen, given the production system that exists in a given area. And commensal wild populations can be derived from previous cultivations. Commensal wild plants can spread by themselves from cultivation or from fallow gardens, or they can be discarded, or they can be transplanted by people into the wild. And all of these things can be seen in the case of taro. Later cultivation can be derived from previous cultivation, for example, by replanting stored seeds or tubers. But later cultivation can also be derived from previously commensal wild plants. So reedy forms of crop species can become a new target for cultivation and selection, and eventually secondary domestication. So these are just some of the possible population categories that we can think of when building up a model of range expansion. So the first model I would like to introduce has commensal wild populations as primary and cultivation as secondary. So this diagram represents range expansion by a single plant species. And on the left, we have the time zero natural range. Translocation leads to the establishment of a commensal wild range before cultivation. And then somewhere within that potentially large, artificially large range, first cultivation can take place. And after that, we can have further dispersal in cultivation by commensal populations and so on. It becomes complicated. And eventually down the track, there might be selection and domestication. There might be or might not be. So translocation of a useful wild plant is often very easy. And range expansion is generally not a simple linear sequence. Populations are networks. And particularly commensal wild populations are networks of breeding populations with their own pollen vectors, seed dispersal agents, and so on. So the wild plants have their own agency even after being introduced by humans into new environments. Domestication requires at least some genetic domestication in a strict sense of genetic domestication requires at least some genetic control and isolation, e.g. through translocation. So if you are growing your plants inside the natural range, you have the possibility of wild gene pool constantly crossing with your cultivated gene pool and making it more difficult to be effective in your selection of a domesticated form. So the expansion of wild plants before cultivation may be a key part of the domestication process eventually. In the second range expansion model, cultivation is primary and commensal wild populations are secondary. And my impression is that in most agricultural literature, this model too is the default assumption for theorists who are working from inside modern agricultural societies. For people living inside the agricultural system, wild plants in the environment are weeds, and it's a common assumption that weedy forms of a crop species are escaped from cultivation. Cultivation is prominent in the mindset. So in this case, we have a natural range, which may be small or large. And the area of first cultivation is taking place within the natural range. And then subsequent to cultivation, we can have the production of commensal wild plants that are moving in and out of cultivated areas, or the cultivated areas are cycling in and out of cultivation, which is what we see with garden and fallow cycles. And then we have all the complex ways that plants expand their range, as shown previously. So this model too is, in a sense, the default model that we hear about most often. And eventually selection and domestication may take place. So my argument here is that this model has really not been given much consideration, both in genetic terms by geneticists looking at the diversity of cultivated plants. Often weedy plants are not analyzed, or their history of range expansion is assumed to be derivative from cultivation, rather than being part of an earlier and longer process of polycultural landscape use. And going back further, I think the polycultural landscapes are composed of many different plant species with many different trajectories. Both models are perfectly valid. The Model 1 range expansion model, Model 2 range expansion model, these are both valid models. They're not mutually exclusive. But consideration of the significance of commensal wild plants has been lacking, I feel. And the graph that I introduced the talk with really is an invented graph. We would need to study different areas in different countries to really sort out the reality of that graph. But here's an example on a small scale in northern Japan of domesticated vegetables growing with no weeds. And this is an attempt at polyculture with total control. It's small scale, it depends on herbicides, it depends on mechanical soil cultivation. But technically, polyculture with fully domesticated plants is possible. But I would argue that most polycultural systems through most of human history, including the Holocene, has been a mix of cultivated and domesticated species, and also all the wild resources that farmers typically make use of. And so if we go back to the hunting, gathering versus agriculture debate in Australia, I think this debate is too much limited by those terms, and Sutton and Walsh are very understanding about the limitations of the terms on the arguments, and I regard their book as very much worth reading. I recommend it. But I think we need other terms besides hunting and gathering and agriculture to use to really analyze what's happened in the past. And I like this idea of polyculture. So that's the end of the talk, effectively. These are some acknowledgements to all the institutions, both in Australia and New Zealand, but also Southeast Asia and Japan, that have supported the wild taro research over a long period of time. And also I wish to give special thanks to all the people who have provided guidance, information, and practical support in the field. So this includes cooks, drivers, farmers, interpreters, forest officers, and last but not least, but researchers and students. And there's a list of references here that can be looked at later. And one last thing, this is Oxfordshire in 2012. This is a idiotypical landscape that was transported from England to its colonies at great cost to many. In some places, this landscape was successfully transported, and others less so. But the old English landscape itself, before the enclosures, before the loss of the commons, that was probably a polycultural landscape. And that's a landscape that Sam Lee, in his song The Garden of England, is paying homage to. Sam Lee, I understand, is a biologist who has become a singer. So I like what he says about seeds having wildness in their blood. That's the end of the talk. Thank you.